The Battle of Thermopylae. There were 300 half-naked Spartans fought against hordes of Persians, one of the most significant events of the ancient world. But by itself it had no great strategic significance. Despite the steadfastness of the defenders, the Persians still broke through and burned Athens. But on the other hand, Thermopylae was important for another reason. They influenced how Greece thought about itself. Because at that moment Greece did not yet exist. It was just a handful of city-states, in which they seemed to speak the same language, and seemed to worship the same gods. But at the same time, many of these Greek city-states believed that they had more in common with the Persians. Any discussion of Thermopylae must begin with Sparta. And after everyone who isn't subscribed to the channel subscribes, please give it a like. Sparta was undoubtedly one of the most extreme communities in human history. Their elders examined every new citizen born, and killed the child if he had physical disabilities. At the age of 7, every Spartan boy entered the state education system, who taught him the art of war. There they were treated cruelly both physically and mentally. They lived in barracks. Individualism was not encouraged before the state and self-sacrifice, and as a result of all this, Sparta had the best heavy infantry in the ancient world. But in Sparta there were also helots, an entire caste of enslaved people upon whom Spartan society was built. In short, Sparta enslaved its Greek neighbors and forced them to do all the hard work. That is why every Spartan had no need to work in the fields or did anything like that, and could only do what it takes to become a soldier. And Sparta constantly feared an uprising by its slaves because by the time of the events in question, there were about 7 helots for every Spartan, so one could even say that Sparta was a society of soldiers not for the purpose of waging war against others, and in order to prevent a revolt of the helots at home. And they preferred to conclude diplomatic agreements of alliance with their neighbors. This paranoia about rebellion was so acute that Sparta often avoided stationing its troops abroad, choosing to defend against internal danger. The helots were kept in constant fear, regularly storming the homes of those who smelled of resistance at night, in addition to the helots themselves, who were already an existential threat. Sparta considered the city of Athens with its democratic system. Athens was the opposite of Sparta in almost every respect. The Athenians did not value individualism. Their society produced not only warriors, but also philosophers, navigators, and playwrights. However, it is important not to confuse Athenian democracy with modern democracy. Then, at best, 30% of the male population had the right to vote. And Athenian women could not own property or run a household, unlike Spartan women, by the way. And foreign slaves, even though they were treated not as badly as the Spartans treated the helots, made up about half the population of this great city-state of equal people. And so, faced with the threat of invasion by Persia, even such irreconcilable rivals as Sparta and Athens were able to unite. Sparta provided diplomatic and military power, while Athens contributed its navy and creative flair. Together, Athens and Sparta fought for freedom and against Persian slavery. But by freedom they meant the freedom to involve the cities of the state in democracy or in a harsh, warlike culture at their own discretion. And what about Persian slavery? Well, of course there were slaves in Persia, especially among the wealthy. But overall, the empire did not rely on their labor. The workers who built the great monuments of Persepolis, laid huge imperial canals and designed underground and drainage tunnels, received wages in accordance with their level of qualification. Moreover, Persian emperors did not typically impose their culture and religion on conquered peoples. The Persians often behaved as liberators rather than conquerors, returning people to their homeland if the previous rulers had expelled or oppressed them. Founder of the empire Cyrus the Great became famous for freeing the Jews from Babylonian captivity. The Jewish elite won, then went home, and Cyrus got a loyal buffer state between Persia and Egypt. So, by the time the Persians clashed with the Greeks at Thermopylae, the Persian Empire stretched from northern India to Egypt and Ethiopia, and the Persian bureaucracy governed this territory very effectively. And as long as the territories paid their taxes and did not rebel, Persia left them alone. However, if they did rise up and rebel, the punishment was merciless. That's how it all began. In 449 BC, the Greek cities in Ionia rebelled against Persian rule and declared themselves democratic states Athens. Of course, after that, they helped its new friends and thereby made permanent enemies for itself. In response, the Persian Emperor Darius swore to raze Athens to the ground and invaded Greece, but suffered a heavy defeat at the Battle of Marathon, after which the Greeks began to expect a large-scale invasion. Already from the son of Darius Xerxes, the Greeks prepared their defenses on 2 fronts. The Athenian fleet was to prevent the Persian fleet from landing troops behind the Greek army, while Sparta and its allies were to hold back the Persian army on land. On a lonely pass, the Persians attacked with an army of 200,000 men, while the Greeks had 7,000. The detachment was led by nearly 300 Spartan hoplites. The main part of the army was to join later, after the sacred holidays were over, provided, of course, that the advance forces were still alive. even though the Persians had numerical superiority. The Greeks chose a good location, a narrow passage that would allow them to fight in shifts, an ideal location for the phalanx. At first, the Persian archers tested the formation, but their arrows could do little against the hoplites in heavy armor. Then Xerxes rescued 2,000 light spearmen who had already been hardened in battle, but their woven shields were useless against long spears. The Persian army was accustomed to operating on plains and in deserts. They practiced a light, mobile form of warfare, which prevented the heavily armored phalanx from being driven out of the narrow passage. Then Xerxes sent the elite royal guard into battle, whom the Greeks called the Immortals. But they also failed to achieve their goal. The Greeks were simply too well armed and in too advantageous a position. But there was still a narrow mountain path that curved around the pass. The Greeks knew about it, and some soldiers were sent to defend this path. But there was a traitor among them who told the Persians about this path. The Persians climbed 1,000 meters, then marched in single file and took the relaxed defenders of this trail by surprise at night. By dawn, the Spartans had reached the rear of the main Greek forces and decided that they would fight in the rear guard while the rest retreated. Several hundred allies decided to stay with them. The victory cost Xerxes dearly. He lost thousands of soldiers and 2 stepbrothers. But in the end, he invaded Greece and plundered the cities that refused to submit. He entered Athens and fulfilled his father's promise to burn the Acropolis as punishment for the revolts in Ionia. However, Xerxes then found the city empty. The Athenian fleet was evacuated from the city, and a month later, this fleet lured the Persian ships into battle at Salamis and dealt them a crushing blow. Then, a coalition of Greek forces led by the Spartans defeated the Persian army at Plataea, putting an end to the war. But why does everyone know about the defeat of the Greeks at Thermopylae? And the other key victories remain unknown, all because Thermopylae helped define Greek and consequently Western culture. And all this thanks to one man, Herodotus. Decades after the Greco-Persian Wars, Herodotus wrote a groundbreaking book about this. It was one of the first books ever written, in which writing history was research rather than myth-making. His inspiring story about the Spartans is a story we all know today. But it is important to remember that Herodotus had a hidden motive. In his stories, he advocated for a common Greek identity, the idea that all these competing city-states had a common culture, religion, language, and values. And within this framework, he constantly contrasted the Greek West, which he portrayed as noble, free, modest, and just, with the Persian East, which he considered emotionally dyspathetic and obsessed with passions and slavery. But in reality, this does not reflect the realities of ancient Greece and Persia, because nothing is ever that simple. This really turned out to be an appealing story for shaping the idea of a global East and West, with opposing, incompatible values, and is still retold as a story of a clash of civilizations, but the truth is always more complex. This contact between Asia and Europe did not save what we call Western civilization, but rather helped to create it. The open society of Athens lasted long enough for subsequent governments to emulate it. Sparta provided its own ideas about serving the state, military professionalism, and compulsory state education. And when Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he liked the local bureaucratic system so much that he simply copied it and spread ideas about professional bureaucracy and a multicultural, tolerant society. We live after Thermopylae, and neither ancient Greece nor Persia represent any of us. We are all heirs to both.